Hi, welcome. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend some time with me in this conversation today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds. And that is to say that the cultures, the systems, the relationships, the societies that we live in have all been created and are still being created in our communication with each other. And the best part of this is that we actually do have some power in that equation too, to change our communication, to change our social worlds. So how do we work towards those better social worlds? Today we're talking to Madison Gonzalez, who is someone who's making our social world better in a few ways. Madison is a poet. She's the executive director of Morning Light Inc., and she is my former babysitter. Today we're talking about Madison's experience with postpartum depression, the importance of celebrating even the small or unexpected parts of ourselves, and creating connection through creative expression. In part one of our conversation today, we get to hear about Madison, her poetry, and some of her most vulnerable parts. And in part two, next week, we will get to learn more about her work with Morning Light Inc., which is a nonprofit that provides end-of-life care to those in hospice. All around, this is an amazing conversation. I hope you find some value in being a part of this conversation today, and feel compelled to come back for part two next week. All right, I won't keep you waiting anymore. Let's jump in. Madison, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, and I'm really excited to talk with you today about storytelling. It's one of my favorite topics.
Me too. And on that note, keeping in mind that the context of this conversation and the direction of it is going to be a real emphasis on storytelling, could you please introduce yourself?
Okay, I could definitely introduce myself, and I could definitely talk for 20 minutes about why I'm into storytelling and my story about storytelling. But I guess I'll just start with the basics. My name's Madison Gonzalez. I am the executive director of a nonprofit in Indianapolis called Morning Light. And we serve the terminally ill who have nowhere to live at the end of life, or no one to support them at the end of life. And they come and they live with us. And so that's a mission that's very close to my heart. But it was through my work there that I got so involved with telling stories because these individuals had such unique perspective that they could share. And I realized that once we could capture those and kind of shed a light on their uniqueness, that the community really came and rallied around our mission. And so I had one individual in particular whose name was Richard, and I can talk, more about him, but he kept a journal by his bedside, and his final entry was, "Too many of us leave this world with our stories untold." And that spoke to me because I realized I hadn't really been sharing my story. And so I started writing poetry, and I started journaling a lot and kind of processing some things. And it was through, telling myself my story that I really kind of learned a lot about who I was. And so I, on paper, I'm all kinds of things, but in my, personal life, I'm a mom of 2 kids. I'm engaged to be married, and that's a whole exciting odyssey in itself. But I just, I have a lot going on. But I think at the root of it all is, just trying to stay true to who you are and what's important to you, and learn a little bit more about yourself, every single day. And so I try to help other people do the same thing. And so I teach on storytelling. I've taught quite a few, workshops on it. I speak on it quite a bit. And so for you to reach out and ask me to talk with you, and I know we have a background, was just really exciting. So I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, that's a great start. And I guess, yes, the one thing I will add to your introduction is that we do go way back, because you used to babysit me 20 years ago. Is that probably accurate?
I think it must have been about 20 years ago. Which
I'm 23 now.
100. No, okay, so let's go with like 15 years ago.
Okay, there you go. There you
knock
go.
a couple of years off. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, out of my own curiosity, a small story to start is, do you have any memories of babysitting us that stick out? Any specific stories, or is it a haze?
Okay, no, that's funny. I think you two were my very first kids that I babysat. And so, I've always had this want to be a mom, right? And I remember as, I don't know how old I was, but I was putting a lot of pressure on myself. And I remember like at home making a list of fun activities. Like, I just hope they like me and I just hope they have fun. And I remember, I think you guys had like one of those little, like little tyke, red and yellow cars.
Probably,
something like that. And
this
I just
sounds
remember
right.
like wearing myself out, pushing you guys around in the basement just so that you guys would think I was cool.
That is funny. And I think about that because I did a lot of babysitting as I've been growing up too, and even like nannied these two kids for a summer. And they were a little younger, like maybe 4 and then, or 5, and then a couple years younger. And that was like, I spent so much time with them that summer. And I just wonder, are they even going to remember me at all? Is this going to shape them at all? And I think maybe, they might not be able to say, oh yeah, Abbie was our nanny in the summer of 2019 or whatever. But I'm hoping in some small ways, like whether they know it or not, the things that I did with them and the things that I don't know, taught them or how I showed up for them, stick with them.
Oh, totally.
Least.
And full circle, your mom is now head of children's ministries, and my little ones, Julia and Bennett, they're 8 and 6. And I know they've gone out to like breakfast with your mom, for VBS and like have gotten to know her. So it's just one of those things that, we're all just kind of shaping each other, I guess, in turns.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really neat too, to think about that big cycle just ongoing and ongoing and ongoing.
Absolutely.
Okay. So first of all, as I was looking back at the questions I sent you, I was realizing that they're kind of hard ones that I thought, I would actually be hard pressed to come up with an answer to these on the spot. They're pretty big ones, but I think they're good ones. So I'm hoping that we can, kind of still work through these together.
I'm pretty good at thinking on the spot, but I also did come prepped with some notes. Good. And these are things that I talk about a lot.
Good. You're practiced.
I'm up for the challenge. I hope the answers are suitable, but
absolutely. I'm sure it's just your story. So there's no right or wrong. So, okay. Well, as you know, the first thing I want to talk about is understanding you more. And the way I want to do that is, who are you today? But first, how did you become who you are today? And so I think the question I want to ask around that is there a story that you remember hearing or living or, being a part of or witnessing in your life that shaped who you are today, that you can kind of look back, connect the dots and say that is part of why I am where I am today?
Well, I think definitely the person that I thought I was going to be, and kind of the narrative that I had of myself when I was, in my teenage years and my early 20s is extremely different than the person that I am now. And I can tell you my personal story, but I also can tell you my very favorite story.
Please.
Yeah. So my very favorite story, like of all time, is Lion King. And I'm a Leo and I am a Disney fanatic. So I think Disney, is still definitely something that I look to for good quality stories. But Lion King, and I know it's a cliche, but to me, whenever I watch it, it's very much about not being able to really escape who you are. The person that you are will find you no matter what, and you can try and hide from that, but you shouldn't have to. You should learn to celebrate it, even when it's a challenge. And that, the scripts that you're told when you're young, the things that you think that maybe you did, or the things that you think maybe you can't do, those are just scripts that can be rewritten. And in the exploration of who you are, you can really rise to the challenge, and who you are is needed. And so I guess I love that story. Lions are my favorite animal. The music's bomb, it's all good. But I always love watching that one. And I think, I kind of lived an essence of that because who I thought I was going to be a stay-at-home mom. And, that was what I put on a pedestal. Ever since I was little, like I said, I had this kind of need to be maternal and just loved kids and thought that I would just want to raise them myself and stay home with them. And I thought that was super important. I had my daughter, absolutely loved it, and decided to have another baby. And so I had my son, almost 2 years later on the dot. And boy, was I not prepared for what was going to happen next. Not only was 2 kids just exponentially harder, but I was hit with some pretty severe postpartum.
Yeah.
And so postpartum is one of those things that I try to share a lot in my story because I do think it's not talked about a whole lot. I do think that,
Absolutely.
there's some shame around postpartum. Does it mean I'm not a good mom? Does it mean I don't
Hmm.
love my kids? Like those kinds of things. And I was just not ready for that. And so that really manifested in a lot of different ways, but it made me a very anxious individual. And I was having, panic attacks, and I was staying home with my kids and doing my best to be a good mom, but I was suffering. And it was about 2 years that, I was trying to get help or trying to
Yeah.
figure out something, to relieve the anxiety. And ultimately it came down to, I need to go back to work.
Mm.
And to me, that felt like I was admitting defeat. And, I don't sit on one side of the spectrum or the other on whether, mom should stay home or go back to work. I think it's unique to everybody. But for
Absolutely.
me, I had a narrative, and I had a script that I wanted to hold. And so it felt like I was failing myself. It felt like I was failing my kids. But I decided to go back to work. And my background is in special events. So I love celebrations. I have always, been about like planning birthday parties and holidays and exciting things and whatnot. I had done exactly one wedding and decided I never wanted to do that again. So when it was time for me to go back to work, I knew I wanted to go into the nonprofit space and hopefully use my special events to maybe help raise some money for a good cause. And that's when I ended up at my job that I'm still at, which is Morning Light. But it's funny because I went back to work part-time, less than 20 hours a week, just doing administrative stuff and getting to have a couple opinions on the special events that we were throwing, and then you fast forward to 5.5 years later and I am executive director. And what happened was I realized that I had all of these skills that I didn't realize were skills. I also realized that when I thought I was going to be stay-at-home mom, I also, under the surface, somehow thought that I didn't have anything that was going to be of value, to the workplace. And I didn't know that some of these things that came quite naturally to me, such as writing, such as, speaking, such as events, such as XYZ, these things that, I just thought were me and that's fine, but nobody's going to employ me, were actually extremely appreciated. And so it was a little bit of like coming into my own by force. I was dragging my feet. Like I did not want to go back to work, but I was not happy in the situation that I was in. And so I think sometimes, if you're self-aware enough, you can pay attention to some of the signs that it's time to do something different. But if you're not, your body or other forces are going to force you to do something different.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And it's through that I think then you can kind of start to realize, okay, maybe I am meant for something else, or maybe I am meant for more. And so now, I look back and I am an executive director. And I promise you, I never in a million years thought I was going to be that.
Yeah.
But I'm very proud of my journey. And I'm very proud of a lot of the challenges that it forced me to really face, and a lot of the insecurities that it really forced me to challenge within myself. It's my hope to empower other people to just explore what they're good at, explore what their interests are, explore your story, see what the false narratives are, because you might be holding these things, about yourself that either you were told somewhere, adopted subconsciously, witnessed somehow, and challenge those things, explore it in a 360 way, because sometimes it's the thing that you really think you're not supposed to be doing that maybe you are supposed to be doing. And now I'm, able to still be a good mom, and probably a better mom because I'm in a much better place mentally, and make a difference every day for a living. And so it's very rewarding. And I guess, not to sound super duper corny, but it's kind of like Lion King, right? Like he went off into the jungle and like Hakuna Matata it and like did not want to like face what was, scary to him, or what he thought he had screwed up or would screw up or whatever, but he was needed. And so that's a little bit about kind of my story and some of the things that forced me to be who I am today, but I'm pretty proud of it.
I think you absolutely should be. I can really appreciate the way that you have come to understand your story, and that I love that you use the phrase that, telling your story to yourself, because I think, there's something in you live your story. This is kind of how we frame it in this like looking at communication, looking at life through the lens of, it being a million little stories, is that you're living your story. And then that's not always exactly the same as telling your story, because you attach all of this meaning to it. And it's because you're looking through the context of, maybe you're able to say, oh, that's kind of like The Lion King. Or like you're talking about, maybe you're looking at some of those stories you were handed and saying, that doesn't actually line up with my own experience. And I think
Exactly.
that's so huge. Yeah. And being able to understand your stories that way, because to me, it's empowering.
Exactly.
When I am the healthiest, when I am the most peaceful, is when I feel like I have a better understanding of, and when I'm able to frame my story in a way that's helpful to me.
Take control of the narrative.
Yes. And I love that already in our conversation, which, I think can continue, is that a good theme and a good frame is celebration. And that seemed to have just kind of presented itself in your life. It's not like you were necessarily saying, okay, celebration is really important. Let me go see how I can work that in. It's something that maybe when you look back, you say, oh, okay, here's a through line, whether it is celebrating who you are or your entire job of hosting these events that bring people together to be able to celebrate and do something awesome.
Absolutely. I always say, when you are able to tell yourself your story or put your story to paper, you can start to identify these kind of common threads, these golden threads, and these themes that, you maybe didn't realize were so prevalent in your life, but this keeps showing up and this keeps showing up and this keeps showing up. And so what does that tell me about either the patterns that, I've created for myself, the things that I'm interested in, the things I want to keep doing, or the things I want to stop doing?
Right.
And so, yeah, I'm glad that you picked that word, because celebration is my favorite word. It really is.
I think it's great. And it's probably not something that I've used to frame my life, but this is why I love these conversations, because I get to borrow, whatever cool things you have to say or that you've already come up with, because I think it's definitely one I want to think about more. And, something that maybe seems like on the complete opposite end from celebration, your experience with postpartum is really still just as tied in, because like you're saying, not that it's, seems easy or like logical that you would celebrate postpartum experience, but there is a layer there that you're saying, I'm going to talk about it. Right. And claim it as part of my story and not be ashamed about it, because it's important for me to do that. And it's important for other people to see you doing that, because that's what lets other people know that they have permission to be honest about that being their experience.
Exactly. And, that's an interesting, I'll have to think on this a little bit more, is kind of celebrating the things as a way of claiming them, because what are we doing when we're celebrating? Does it have to be something that's positive, or could it just be something that you are lifting up, and making a show of a bit? Because I guess, it was probably one of the hardest things that's happened to me, but it is something that I am, I don't wish didn't happen to me, because I wouldn't be who I am, right? And I wouldn't be where I am. And postpartum taught me a lot about my own limits as a human being. And it taught me a lot about not resisting what's not meant for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately it was postpartum too that led me to start writing, which, I'm a poet, and that's how I choose to share my story. When I teach on storytelling, everybody can share their story in different ways, right? Through photography, through public speaking, through poetry, through art. There's so many ways to capture and share your story. My medium is poetry. I like the abstractness of it. I think it can be universal, which is true with, photography and art as well. But it was my poem about postpartum called The Pit, which was my very first poem to be, published professionally in the Indianapolis Review, and kind of the poem that I shared that then got me some traction and got me interviews and these different things. And I thought it was so interesting, because it was just something that I wanted to put to paper, and it was just something that I remember thinking, when I'd written it, I remember thinking, do I keep this to myself? Do I share this? I don't want people to misjudge me. I don't want people to know about my postpartum, because I don't want them to think I'm a bad mom.
Yeah.
But it was actually when I shared that poem publicly that I got tons of emails and whatever, about, hey, I had the same exact thing, and I don't know anyone else who has experienced this, and I don't know who to talk to, and I don't know what to do. And, suddenly just in the simple act of kind of sharing something you created or sharing your story, you're creating all of these connections and you're helping people, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I love about stories and narratives and sharing those, is that it's through those things that you can give your pain meaning. It's through those things that you can validate what you went through, because you can start to see how it can create these connections or these positives or these relationships you wouldn't have had otherwise. You give other people permission to feel their truth, you know, and share their truth. There's just so much power in that.
Absolutely. You're making me think two things. First is that my theory is that the things that feel the hardest for us to share, the stories that are the hardest for us to share, the ones where we feel really vulnerable, we're really kind of, you know, saying this is me, this is, you know, a very raw version, it's not polished, you know, maybe some of those stories where we messed up or we didn't know what we were doing, we maybe didn't look the best in those stories. They're so hard to share, and they're the ones that we most need to share. And they're the ones that we most want to hear from other people. It's like,
Absolutely.
I know how I feel when other people share those kinds of stories. I feel like connected to that person. I feel like I can really know them on a deeper level. I feel like we've talked about the permission to also experience all those things. But there's the flip side of it that's a little harder, is that it's harder for me to step up and want to share those things. So I have to keep reminding myself that these are the best kind of stories, actually.
Absolutely.
The unpolished, messier ones.
Absolutely. And I think too, something I've noticed in myself and that I'm still not perfect at, is I can share my vulnerable stories once they're wrapped up with a happy ending. It's the ones that I'm experiencing in live time that I have trouble saying, hey, I'm still struggling with this.
I'm in it right now. Yeah.
I'm in it and I don't have a solution yet. I don't have the answer yet. You know, those moments are extra vulnerable for me, and probably something that I'm still not super wonderful at doing, to be honest. And so I do wonder sometimes if the observers or those people who are needing permission, you know, to step up and share their story are the ones that are still living it. And they might be quiet, you know, they might be just watching from the sidelines. They might just be reading what you have to say, but knowing that that is still having an impact on them, even if you're not aware of it. You know, I love that idea of kind of just, it's like this, I have a tattoo of it. It's this dandelion image of, you know, you don't know where those seeds are going to land. You don't know what is going to, you know, grow from that, but that's not why you do it. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it because it's a release for you. You know, you do it because it's your authenticity, and that's important. But you don't always know the impact that your story is going to have. And you may never know the impact that your story had on somebody. But I think it's still just a cool concept to know that your words, your experiences do have power, and give others permission, like you said.
It's okay. So the perspective I come from is that, so I graduated from college in May of 2022, and I studied interpersonal communication. So that's kind of the lens that I just see my whole life through. And so one of the phrases that we use is the creative power of communication. And that's to say that, you know, it's our communication that has the ability to create these better social worlds for ourselves. And I was going to ask, you know, does that idea resonate with you in your poetry? But I can already see that the answer is yes, from how you just explained your poetry, and especially your whole process with your first poem and putting it out there. And like you said, seeing the effects, but never really being able to know the effects, is that you seem to recognize that your communication of these ideas, your communication of these experiences through poetry is in and of itself creating something new.
Completely. Yeah. You create opportunity for connection. You create opportunity for others to see the world in a different way, or to feel less alone, which I'm a big believer in, that need to create. And I think that, I think that everybody has it within them to create, right? We are both creation and we are both creators, and we are not one without the other.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
And so I think, you know, it's a way to connect with others, because we all have that ability, and you don't know what you create might, you know, spark in someone else to create, and then someone else to create. And so I just love that ripple effect.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about creating, creativity, and those words obviously having the same root, but I think about them so differently. And then the other word I would throw into that mix that I've been thinking about is imagination, and thinking that everything that exists in our world started in somebody's imagination.
Absolutely.
I felt maybe very disconnected from imagination. It's not something we talk about, but it's so important. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think it connects also to empathy in our relationships, in our communication, because you have to be able to use your imagination to empathize with people.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah, right. I've never really framed it that way until recently. I've just been like playing around with these words, but I love those ideas of being in your imagination more, maybe being more aware of it as a force. And also, like you're saying, seeing yourself as a creator. And there's, you're creating things in big ways. You specifically with like the work that you do, there's big things that you're creating there. And then also on a much smaller level, there's creation going on. Even you and I talking right now is creating something new into the world. And that's how I felt with my podcast, that I can look and see how many listeners I have. And I'm like, okay, well, I know, 30 of these are my mom listening to all these episodes. But then there's, 2,000 more that I'm like, I don't know who these people are. I don't know how it's hitting them. I don't know what their context is, what I'm speaking into. But I trust that, once it's out of my hands, it's into their hands, and the people do with it what they need to do with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's that's such an exciting concept is, being able to make a difference. I've been doing some reading on brain waves and brain frequencies, and it's talking about how, obviously when we're younger, everything is creation, everything is imagination to a kid. Nothing is either possible or impossible. They can create their own reality through playing pretend or through, observing things. And up until a certain point, even when you're watching a movie, you don't know if this is real or if this is imagination.
Yeah.
You can't decipher. And it's talking about how, adults trying to get back into our, meditative practice in our heads to create the brain frequencies that then allow us to think outside the box. Because, it's hard when you're an adult and you have a to-do list as long as your arm and all these different people are needing things from you. And some realities, harsh realities probably, and solutions become more difficult to come by in a way because everything seems so concrete. But if you're able to get back into that meditative brain space and kind of try and remove some of those stress blockers that keep your brain from having these pathways and this energy and this flow that allows you to think differently, it's so important. And again, I think, what you said about empathy, you need to be able to open your mind to other versions of reality. Because your version of reality and your story isn't the same as everyone else's. And I remember being so kind of mind blown when I realized like, oh, that's not important to everyone else, or, that's only important to me, or, oh, that's only ever happened to me or them or XYZ, when it's like through that realization, you're able to realize that there are millions of versions of reality out there, and we've created them for ourselves. And through that empathy, being able to understand that maybe there's other ways to look at something. Even the same story has two sides, right? They say this, every story has multiple sides. And so my version of that story and your version of that story might not look the same, but it's in honoring that person's humanity and that person's creator in them. We all have a creator within us, and we all have a ability to create. That's just fact. And so to honor that in each other is what connects us together, in my opinion. And so you don't have to see that story the same way, but you can still respect and honor a story that someone else has shared. But I'd never thought about imagination and empathy being kind of almost one and the same. And I think that's really a cool way to frame that.
Well, like as an example, even you sharing your story about your experience with postpartum is not only important for the people who have also experienced postpartum, Like that's valuable for me to hear that story, or other people that have not had experience with postpartum, or maybe know people that have experienced postpartum, but don't really know what it was like, because then we get to use the imagination, the empathy to step in and to really see your humanity, see the humanity of other people that experience that. And I just think that's beautiful.
Definitely. And, I do think even if it's not the same exact scenario, people can find grains of themselves in all kinds of situations. And, when you're listening to a story, what you're really listening to is how it fits with you. You know, can you see yourself in that story, and which elements of that? But then you're right. It's the next step that means, okay, I can't see myself in that story, but I can still understand its importance and value. And I think, you know, the more we can encourage people to try and look at things that way, the more unified we will all be.
Yeah. Yeah. I also write poetry, and that's not something that I've done. Like, I guess, okay, I did get one thing published at my university, but I don't know if you experienced this. I look back at old things I've written, and sometimes I'm like, that's only kind of okay. That I don't know what I was thinking.
For sure.
And then sometimes I look back and I'm like, I'm a genius. That's amazing that I wrote. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important. I encourage everyone to go back and reread their old work, because sometimes I think you're telling yourself something you needed to hear today back then. You know, there's things that you might write that you forgot you wrote, and then you go back and you're like, oh my gosh, I really needed to hear that today. Thank you, past self, for telling me what I needed.
So I think it's interesting, though, to think about, like you're saying, these different levels of our storytelling, of telling it to ourselves, telling it to maybe one or two other people, telling it to even more people than that. And, you know, seems like you've had experience with all of those, since you do have a book of poetry, which is super cool. And by the way, I have, because my mom told me that you wrote it. And this, even before we talked, this is like last year I've read this book from you.
That's so cool.
And I loved it. And I think it's really powerful. And so I just love to hear you talk more about your book, Dear Mirror, and how it came about, and, you know, what it means to you.
Okay. It was about 2019 that I picked up a pen, and I didn't put it down for like months straight. And really, you know, it's funny. Dear Mirror is funny because, like you said, sometimes I even look in that book and, like, full transparency, I'm like, oh, that could have been better. And I've written so much work since, and I have another book coming out, but that's still very, like, in the rough copy. And I think it's a little bit different than Dear Mirror. But Dear Mirror, I think I was writing it to myself, right? It's Dear Mirror, it's Dear Self. It's broken into 4 parts, right? And there's different kinds of mirrors. You have your mirror that distorts things. You know, you have your concave mirrors, which are internal. And that's a distortion of your internal view of yourself. You have your convex mirrors, which are external, which is the world's, you know, version of you that maybe isn't accurate, right? And you're still seeing yourself through their lens. And then there's refraction, which is when a mirror, you know, starts to distort light and change the direction of light. And then there's reflection. And so the journey through Dear Mirror is taking a look at maybe some of the internal scripts I had, external scripts I had, the changing, you know, the moment you start to realize, like, hey, maybe this isn't actually accurate. And then the reflection and trying to see myself for who I really was. And so that was such a cool experience to write that and get that published. And I mean, it's just a very fond time in my life, but I still keep writing, and I have, you know, I share online, and I've been in literary magazines and whatnot. But it was through my writing that I think I really came to realize some truths that I really didn't want to, but, like I said, needed to be recognized for healing and for moving forward and to really stepping into yourself. And so I'm just a big fan of poetry, and I'm engaged to a poet as well. And so it was through the writing of poetry and then sharing that online. He, I guess, started reading what I had to say and liked that. He is a incredible poet, like blows my stuff out of the water. And so obviously I started reading his stuff and liked what he had to say. And it was actually through our poetry that we were like, I kind of like dig, you know, your view on the world and what you have to say.
So
you know,
sweet.
You clearly have a deep soul. Like, do you want to talk on the phone sometimes? And then we started talking on the phone every day. And now, almost 3 years later, we're getting married in May. So poetry has the power to connect. You know what I mean? I'm not, this isn't a plug that you're going to go find like soulmate or whatever through poetry, but I do think it's a good lens to see into what people are thinking, you know?
Well, I was going to ask, you know, which we've kind of danced around already, you know, what does poetry mean in your life? And it seems like it means everything. Like, it's brought you to the person you're going to marry. It's brought you so much healing for yourself.
I mean, that's a loaded question. What does poetry mean to me? I mean, I think poetry is just my form of art and self-expression. You know, when we talk about creating, it's just, it does require some imagination, you know, and it's my, It's how I get in touch with some of the more abstract parts of my brain. And quite honestly, I haven't been writing it as much as I wish I could be lately, because real life, there's
Yep.
too much real life going on. And so, that's a theme that keeps showing up for me right now is when I start losing time for my art, I know that's time for me to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you start losing time or putting off the time to connect with yourself and your emotions and your thoughts and your dreams and your hopes and your issues, whatever, you have to make time for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever that looks like for somebody, it's important. But to me, it looks like sitting down and writing poetry. So it's connecting to myself, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's important to make time for yourself, and it's important to make space and quiet enough to actually listen to yourself. It's kind of what we've already talked about with stories, which would be, my answer to the question, what am I like paying attention to? What's a theme that's coming up in my life? Is this idea of, for most of my life, I've always looked outward to other people to kind of confirm, like, what do you think about this? Is this the right choice? What should I be doing? How does that person feel about what I'm doing? Looking for like consensus among people. And there are people in my life whose opinions I do care about. But really, I was looking to everyone else to tell me what I should want, or to give me those scripts and say, okay, this is what your life's going to look like, rather than, I guess I couldn't distinguish between what I wanted and what I thought other people wanted of me. And so that's something I, think about a lot and kind of have been trying to grow away from. And it's a hard practice to find stillness enough in myself to actually distinguish, okay, what's my voice? And how can I find consensus not out there, but in here, like between like my head, my heart, my soul, like what am I wanting for myself? And for me, poetry is also a way that
100%.
It brings that out of me. Yeah.
There is so much noise. There is so much noise out there, so many different ways you can be bombarded with noise. And I think probably now more than ever, it's hard to put it down. It's hard to escape it. You've got it in the palm of your hand and everywhere else. Finding that quiet time used to be very scary for me. I think that's something that I was exploring a lot last year, was kind of noticing how friends or myself just needed one person to confirm or give me permission to do something I knew I already wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do it, but it's like, I'll go ask this person. And if they say yes, then that's the green light. Then I've made a good decision. So it's like you said, finding enough time with yourself to figure out how if you're making a good decision that's right for you or not. And getting in touch with what your body and intuition is telling you about certain things, because it knows, it knows. You feel it in your gut if you're doing the right thing. You feel it in your pulse if you're excited about something.
Yeah. You just have to learn to listen to your body's signals, because it's telling you things. It's true. Just, there's not a lot of areas, I think, in your life growing up where you are taught how to listen to your body.
Not at all.
You are not really taught to speak the language of your body.
No. And that's like, I'm going through something right now on, the somatic nerve, and it's got, it's the biggest nerve in your body, right? And it's the nerve that's triggered when you're having traumas and XYZ. And this stuff needs to be taught in schools. We should be taught that as little ones, that if your feet start to tingle, like that's telling you something. If your throat is catching and you are, your mouth goes dry, like what is that telling you? And what does that mean? And I know, when you're little, it's hard to kind of flesh that out and like explore that entirely. But if you can start to learn those trends, that your body is telling you, we might be able to shut out some of that noise on the outside world that we use to either distract or get confirmation that, we're okay. We're enough. We're doing the right thing. Everyone else is, or everyone else thinks this, or these 5 people I care about think that. And checking in with yourself and having enough time for quiet is so important, because your body will tell you in quiet ways. But if you keep going down the wrong path, it will tell you in loud ways that
right.
knock you out. And so I know you had said, what's something that you're paying attention to a lot in the world or in my life. And for me at the moment, it's burnout. I have a bad habit of, burning myself out on a routine basis and trying to catch it earlier in the process so that I don't get to that point.
Yep. And I think that's one a lot of people are
it's a common
playing
thing.
with right
I'm
now. Yeah.
seeing it all over the place, in work, in my personal and professional life. I know a lot of people who are going through it, and I wonder why. It's like, why
I
why
think
do
it
we do
speaks to
that to
something bigger,
ourselves?
right? Like
Yeah,
if every single person I talk to could say, oh, I've felt burnout. I'm currently feeling burnout. I've experienced burnout. I think it's less about what am each of us individually doing wrong? What are each of us
oh,
doing
so
wrong? And
true.
more like, okay, let's talk about the society and the culture that we live in that
Exactly.
raises being busy. And because, this, like, I guess I'd call it like a productivity culture of like your value comes from what you can produce.
Completely. And glamorizes the busier you
Yeah.
are, the
Yep.
better you are. The busier you are, the
Yes.
more important you are. And I
Yeah.
did read something that said, step one of burnout is this strong desire to prove oneself.
Yeah.
And that's where it starts, and so then it becomes, okay, why do I need to prove myself? And what am I looking for? And why don't I feel enough as I am? Why do I have to push myself to this point of exhaustion all of the time? And I think you're right. I think it's definitely systemic and societal and cultural to be as busy as possible. So more than ever, it's important to make that time to listen to yourself and write some poetry, right?
Yeah, because it's like you're saying, it's not a surface level problem. So I don't think it has a surface level solution. Where if you're like, okay, I'll just not go to this one event, or I'll just do this one thing. If you're doing those actions, that's good. But if your belief under it doesn't change,
Amen. Yes.
then those actions are kind of meaningless to, your deeper experience of life, because maybe you said, okay, I'm taking this day for myself, but deep down you believe that you actually don't deserve a day to rest.
Oh, so
or
true.
You shouldn't actually take a day to rest because it's selfish or whatever, then that's not actually going to be a good day of rest for you.
Absolutely.
And so you need the time
That's
to
so
actually,
true.
get in contact with, your inner self and rest. But, it's hard.
Yeah. Being in alignment with yourself is a lifelong process, right? And I think that's important to recognize too, that can change over time. What that looks like, what you need, who you want to be that day. It doesn't have to be the same every day, and what used to work for you might not work for you anymore. And just checking in with yourself on a routine basis on what does alignment mean to me in this phase of my life, so that my actions are stemming from my alignment with myself and not to prove myself to anybody else, So that's a good point, though. It's definitely not surface.
The question I want to end on is kind of a stacked question, but we've talked about maybe some stories from your childhood that affected you. You were a part of my childhood and have surely shaped me. What is the story that you are hoping that your kids take with them from their childhood?
Oh my goodness. Oh,
I know. Sorry, it came out of nowhere. I've been sitting on that one.
That's such a loaded question. I want my kids to see 1,000 little stories of them being allowed to be themselves. I want my kids to see that they don't owe anything to anybody but themselves. And that doesn't mean don't be a good person and not, consider others, but it means your life is yours and you have one life to live. And if we aren't on this earth to enjoy it, then what the heck are we all doing? The theme throughout is that I very much try to just empower them to make their own decisions. What do you think about that? And I hope that when they look back on their childhood, they can see that they have the privilege and the power and the permission to make the decisions that are best for them. That's all I've got on that one. But
no, that's great. I'm sure that could be its own podcast
that
episode.
Could be its own podcast entirely. I guess that's my just philosophy on motherhood and life. But that's what I try to embody for them. And I did it for myself. So, I had to make some pretty tough calls that they've witnessed and been a part of. And I've had to explain to them, this is why I had to do this. And it's tough decisions, right? It's like hard decisions that maybe don't make sense to anybody else but you. But I hope that being able to watch me do that for myself, they can do the same thing.
That is all for part 1 of our conversation with Madison, but come back for part 2 next week. We'll be talking about Madison's work with Morning Light Inc. and diving into some conversations around death and grief that can feel like a lot and feel easier to run away from than to lean into. But I invite you to lean in with us and know that you're in good company as we journey together into these hard but important conversations. A couple of things I want to ask you today. 1, share this episode or any of your favorite episodes with someone who you want to invite into this space. Who do you want to be your co-creators in your social world? 2, follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. Take some time to reflect on what these conversations mean to you. It means a lot to me if you can express that in the form of ratings and reviews. 3, follow the Stories Live, Stories Told Instagram, which I will link. Check out the website, which I will also link. And check out the stuff I'm posting on YouTube. And last but not least, please reach out. I want to be in conversation with you, so DM me on Instagram, comment on YouTube, email me, or use the contact page on the website. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. We share the same goals of reflecting on our communication, learning the power of storytelling, and working to make better social worlds. I'll link their website so you can check out all the amazing things that they have going on. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. Keep creating mindful moments, and until next time, I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Live, Stories Told.